So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Norton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association, and I will be moderating tonight's discussion. Whether you have been following this project since the beginning, or this is the first time you're tuning in, it is our intention that this event will be interesting and informative for you. First, some housekeeping. I don't have to tell you where the exits or the bathrooms are. They are where they have always been in your home. So that should be comforting. But I do want to say, if you have any technical difficulties, please email charles@crwa.org or post something in the chat. Our staff are monitoring those. This is the first event in our virtual series, so please have patience with us if anything glitches. And we are excited to have nearly 200 RSVPs for this event. Everyone is on mute. If you have any questions or comments, and we hope that you do, please post them in the Q&A box anytime, and we will get to those after both speakers are done. So first, I would like to, if I can figure this out, why is this not going down? Is this one? See, already starting. First, I would like to introduce our panelists. Pallavi Mande is CRWA's Director of Watershed Resilience and has been with CRWA since 2005. Pallavi received her bachelor's in architecture from New Delhi, India, a master's in philosophy, environment, and development from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and a master in architecture and urban design from Washington University. Pallavi has served on the Brookline Conservation Commission since 2015 and currently co-chairs the Brookline Open Space Planning Committee. She recently completed her Loeb Fellowship at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. We are also thrilled to have Ari Ofsevit as our other panelist. Ari is a Boston Program Senior Associate with the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. He also serves on the board of Transit Matters, a regional transit advocacy group in Boston. He has twice been honored as Advocate of the Year by Livable Streets and spent several years as a member of the Cambridge Bicycle Committee. He has a bachelor's degree in geography and urban studies from Macalester College and a Master of Science in Transportation and Master of City Planning from MIT. Couple overachievers here speaking today. So first, some background on CRWA. We were founded in 1965 by a group of residents disgusted with the state of the Charles River, and we have played a starring role in the cleanup of the Charles ever since. In fact, one of our next webinars on April 30th tells that story. We use science, advocacy, and the law to continue to work to protect and restore the river and its watershed. And this is the first in our virtual event series. We have several others coming up you might be interested in. Our next one on April 25th is a Parks and Rec Trivia Night to support CRWA. April 30th, the story of the Charles River cleanup with former Executive Director Bob Zimmerman. And May 7th, Climate Resilience for Activists. We are co-presenting with Crew on that one. That's an arm of 350 Mass. And then May 14th, we're talking about dams and removing them, past and present and future, including the Watertown Dam. We have our eye on that one. So I hope that you will be back for all of those. So tonight's topic. First, I want to just lay out some background how we got here. MassDOT has identified the existing I-90 viaduct to be structurally deficient and nearing the end of its useful life. The area also sees higher crash rates due to its design, and there are numerous other design issues. There's an old abandoned rail yard, which you can see over here, which many of us think could be put to better use. There's lack of access to the Charles River, terrible condition of the riverbank, and other issues. So many of us, there are many stakeholders with an interest in a better design. A task force was established in 2014, and CRWA has served on it since the beginning, and Pallavi has been our member. Many meetings were held in order to figure out what the best design would be that would accomplish the most public benefit. And in January 2019, Stephanie Pollock, the MassDOT secretary, announced that she had chosen the hybrid model, it was called, where Soldiers Field Road would be elevated, the Mass Pike would be built slightly below grade, and there would be more land freed up for parks, the bike path, riverbank restoration. And we, along with many groups, were excited about this choice. But then a few months later, it was revealed that this model required building a quote-unquote temporary road into the Charles River for 8 to 10 years. And we were not okay with that. To put it mildly, roads and rivers are not simpatico. And other groups had many other concerns, and Ari is going to cover many of those. So we are not holding this event just for fun or because we have run out of things to do trapped at home. We are doing this because this is your road. These are your parklands, your tax dollars at work, and your river. And you have the power to have an impact. And in fact, arguably, you already have. MassDOT received approximately 1,600 comments on all aspects of the river, and of those, over 400 were saying that we don't want a road in the river. So we were very pleased to announce, to see MassDOT announce, literally just this past Monday, this is a screenshot of their live streamed meeting, that they're going back to the drawing board to look at alternatives that also do not entail putting a road in the river, as well as do more to take into account climate change, climate resilience, and environmental justice. So what we're looking for tonight is to share with you our vision for what this $1 billion+ project should look like. We'd like to hear your thoughts, and then we encourage you to make your voice heard with your elected leaders because they work for you. And with that, I will turn it over to Pallavi.
Thanks for the great introduction, Emily. So I'm going to quickly sort of give insight into where this project is situated for those of you who don't quite know the bearings. This is, as Emily mentioned, located in Allston. So I just wanted to orient everybody in terms of the location of the project. It's right in Allston, next to the river. The commuter rail section is what Ari is going to be focusing a little bit on, but my presentation is mostly focused on how the project fits into the broader stormwater management and flood resilience context. This is what you see of the project right in what is famously called as the throat area. As you can see, the cross-section here is very constrained. So a lot of the alternatives that have been formulated have been trying to figure out how you can fit the different modes from Store Drive, the Pike, the rail corridors, and the pedestrian and bike transit through this narrow section of right-of-way. What I'm going to be talking mostly about is sharing with you the current DOT proposed layout for the project, including what they are proposing as temporary roadway in the river for the construction duration. We're going to examine the existing stormwater and flood inundation context for the project, and then look at how we see that as an opportunity for looking at sub-watershed level restoration as well as riverbank restoration. And then I end with some discussion and next steps. So as I mentioned, this is what has been proposed as the layout for the project. What you see in highlighted in yellow is all the infrastructure that is at grade. What is highlighted is in blue is what's coming on fill. And the section that's highlighted in brick red is what's on some bridge infrastructure. As you can see on the river edge, there's a new park that's being proposed. And this is the section which is referred to as the throat area, which I'm going to zoom in on. And as you can see, this particular option that has been identified as the hybrid option stacks Soldiers Field Road right on top of the eastbound section of the Pike. So it gets us some additional room to accommodate increased parkland and the Paul W. White pathway. This is what the proposed hybrid option looks like in cross-section. As you can see, again, there is Soldiers Field stacked right in top of the westbound section of the Pike. This is the eastbound, and as you can see, we are able to accommodate the various modes of transportation, including the Paul W. White, improved section of the Paul W. White within the right-of-way. So this option, as Emily mentioned, we were pretty happy with because it was not impacting the river in any way, and we were able to accommodate all the users in terms of multimodal into the existing cross-section. However, once the the discussion was focused on construction, we found out that there was, in fact, going to be a temporary roadway, relocation of Soldiers Field Road into the river. There's a cross-section for about 80 feet that has been projected into the river about 50 feet from the existing riverbank. And that has huge consequences in terms of impacts to the river. Not only are we looking at possible sediment disruption from suspended silt, as well as other contamination, whether it be toxic metals or chemicals into the water column. We're seeing water quality degradation with increased erosion, fuel and oil spills, as well as excess nutrients and bacteria. And finally, there are obviously impacts to the aquatic habitat in the river. With rising temperatures, we see lowered oxygen levels, as well as increased growth of invasive species and decreased biodiversity that we would see impact, as well as with algal bloom, there are consequences for human health as well. So we've been up in arms about this proposal for the last 6 months. We've testified at various meetings of DOT and the FMCB board. And the good news, at least some of it, has been that we saw acknowledgement from DOT on what they've heard in terms of opposition to this proposition, and actual commitment to seeing alternatives which would not have the temporary stressor structure in the river. This was a live stream presentation from earlier this week on Monday, and we seem to be making some headway on that, so that's good news. What I wanted to share with you now is where the project sits in terms of its urban context. This is the area of North Allston Brighton, and as you can see in gray, there's a large section of impervious cover in this area, everything from roadway to parking lots to just paved areas. And as a result of that, every time we have a big storm, there is a lot of flooding that this area has seen over time, and with climate change, that's only becoming worse. This has also resulted in instances of overflowing manholes and disruption to everyday life, with basements getting flooded. And so this area has seen over the course of the last decade a huge issue with flooding and stormwater management, which we are hoping this project can help address. Part of the reason why, in addition to the impervious cover, this area has seen a lot of flooding is historically there were tributaries that were going into the Charles that were draining this area, which have been over time buried underground. So what you see highlighted in blue are the historic tributary areas which have been put in underground culverts to drain the river, drain this section into the river. And these are all at capacity. So every time there is additional rainfall, there's nowhere for the water to go. So you see the flooding happening in your street right away. With climate projections that have been modeling that has been undertaken, we are seeing not only impacts with coastal flood risk, which takes into account the Charles River Dam still being in place, but as you can notice, the stormwater flooding is way more intense. So when you combine the two, you can see that a large part of this area is going to be inundated by 2070 by almost water that could be around 10 feet. So seeing these projections into the future, we are really looking for every chance we get to retrofit this project with what is known as green infrastructure. And I'll talk about how that could also be a positive for all the heat impacts that this area is seeing as part of the climate projections. So not only are we looking at, during wet weather, huge flood impacts, but during the summer months, the number of hot days in the summer above 95 has gone up by many-fold in the last decade. So where I mentioned green infrastructure, we are looking at soil and plant-based strategies to retrofit these impervious cover with strategies that would replicate the natural hydrology of an area into the impervious cover. So the idea is to replicate the decreased runoff and increase infiltration, which when you cover the natural forested landscape to an urbanized landscape, you can see there's a huge difference in terms of the amount of runoff and infiltration. So we are trying to retrofit these urban areas with the green infrastructure to be able to replicate those numbers. And as a result, we've sized in the different watersheds different kinds of strategies. May be bioswales, constructed wetlands, inundated parkways, to be able to not only combat urban heat island effect, but be able to provide some flooding storage capacity as well as water quality improvements. These are pictures looking at the underground culverts that I mentioned to you. They're spewing polluted stormwater that is generated on roadways and paved areas into the river. And we see this project as an opportunity not only address erosion along the riverbank, but also implement strategies that would treat runoff that's coming through these pipe culvert areas into the river. These are just examples of other cases where riverbank restoration has been done. This particular one is from Everett with the Wynn Casino, where they've installed a living shoreline as well as coastal bank restoration. And it's been very successful in terms of both water quality improvements as well as bringing back a lot of local flora and fauna. Again, some sections showing how the wetland has been restored, as well as the marsh that existed in this area has been increased, given that this is a tidal river still. So there's a whole swath of salt marsh restoration that was undertaken at this project, which has been very successful. This is in our own watershed, the Muddy River, which was daylighted about 4 years ago in different phases, and you can see the riverbank restoration has been a key part of this with native species, and now there's a huge concern to take this project to the next phase and extend it further into Brookline. So coming back to what we can expect to see in terms of next steps on the I-90 project, we are looking to hear about the scoping summary this summer. The project will go through a notice for project change as part of the NEPA process, also in the summer of 2020. And the next couple of stages will involve submission of the DEIS to NEPA as well as the FEIS to NEPA. So both the MEPA and the NEPA processes are running in tandem. And from our end, we see further coordination with the various stakeholders that have been involved with this project and taking this to everybody who should be invested in this section of the river and the future that it holds. We'll be reviewing Mass DOT's response to comments that Emily mentioned. There's been about 1,600 comments that DOT received, and they are currently in the process of responding to those, and they will issue those in the summer. We're going to be continuing our advocacy for the temporary alternatives for the temporary road in the river, as well as climate resilience and river restoration. So to stay involved, please check out our project website and do sign up for our newsletters. And we'll be taking questions right after Ari's presentation. So I'm going to stop my screen share and move on to Ari's.
All right, can people see the screen?
Yes.
All right, I can't see it. That's the only problem. Hold on a sec. Well, let's see. Okay, view. Just go to the top here. I gave the ending away there. Sorry about that. View, present. Okay. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks to the CRWA for having me. I just want to give a little background on myself. I'm a Cambridge resident. I grew up in Newton, so I've sort of followed the Charles in towards Boston. And I was actually on a CRWA stream team in high school, so not only a few years ago. I volunteer extensively with the Livable Streets Alliance. I'm the project lead for this project on that, have been for about 5 years, and with the Transit Matters organization to promote transit in Boston. My day job is working to promote bus rapid transit in Boston, so I'm all about sustainable transportation. Obviously, with the current situation we have, everything has been thrown into the wind, but that's what I've been doing. Livable Streets and Transit Matters are both great organizations. If you don't know about us, check us out, livablestreets.info, transitmatters.org. That's my quick plug. As part of this project, I've been working with a group of stakeholders, including folks from CRWA and many others, called the term the People's Pike, which is based on a concept of having what we call a people's turnpike, which would be a people way for bicycles and pedestrians and others parallel to and connecting across the turnpike. So outline, what we've talked about so far is impact of river unavoidable? Why are we here? And really what kind of trade-offs are there? We want to have a good project both during and after the project. And how do we have a project that prioritizes the environment, bicycle pedestrian access, and increased transit use rather than peak automobile throughput, which is sort of where we are. Unavoidable river impact, as we were just shown, not all impact is bad per se. The current riverbank is 1930s era riprap, so big rocks that were put in there when they built the road, Soldiers Field Road in the 30s. They were not thinking environmentally. So it could be better, but we don't want it being better to come at the expense of 10 years of impact or a bad outcome for transit and people. The big question, I think, is what is the least impact we can have during the project and wind up with the best possible outcome in the long run? And can we balance all of the competing interests? Well, not actually competing interests. A lot of these dovetail with each other. Green space, riverbank access, transit, reduce pollution, reduce traffic. Where are our priorities? There are these sort of two lists that we look at. One starts with cars, and then construction costs, and how many cars can we push through, and then starts to think about transit and pedestrians, and then, the environment's on that list, but only because regulations require it. And the other one turns it around. What's environments and pedestrians and bicyclists first, and then at transit, at how we can get people through with the least amount of impact, and then looks at how we also accommodate vehicles. And why we're here is the turnpike needs repair. The Worcester line, which runs along it, has continued to grow in recent years and actually has a lot of room to grow with strategic investments. It already carries at rush hour as many people by transit as by car along this river. And that the turnpike, in addition to separating the river, to being right up along the river, is a wall between the river and the neighborhoods along it. So where have we been? Taking a couple steps back, this is the sort of the first concepts that were put forward by the project team, and I'm showing this just to show that we have made some progress. These were what they were calling their suburban style interchanges, which were going to take the current ramps and make them bigger and higher and make the viaduct wider and not really have any new buildable realm, not increase any parkland, and have a huge railway layover yard where they would just store trains in the middle of the day. The community and community groups have all said this is unacceptable, and we have made some success. So we've moved away from the expanded highway viaduct. We have moved to including West Station, which would be a hub where people would be able to transfer between trains and buses from the western corridor of the state going to Kendall Square, Harvard Square, and downtown Boston. We have seen some improvements to the river edge and some increased parkland, although obviously we want more. We've seen some improvements to what we call the street grid, so it can be more pedestrian friendly to get around in this area, not just a web of highway ramps that it is today, and that was originally proposed. And this has been going on through 6 years of task force meetings, and Pallavi has been at a lot of those, and there's been a lot of process, some of it good, some of it frustrating, but we have made some progress. Now, where are we trying to go? I think we need to start having some pretty frank discussions about how much actual need we have for all the highway lanes that are being put forward. It's sort of an if you build it, they will come idea. West Station, it's good that it's now included in the project, but we need it to be built early so that it can be used during the project and doesn't hamper transit when we have highway reductions as well. We need to be functional so that people can use it to get where they want to go, that it has high frequency, that people can get to West Station, to go to Harvard Square, to go to Kendall Square so they don't have to drive. And we need to have capacity to move people back and forth into this area. We need to increase bicycle and pedestrian facilities and river edge facilities. And this really needs to be a transit first approach to incentivize non-car travel. The area is owned by Harvard University, and it is planned to have a lot of development. And we can either build it in a way that really is forward-thinking 21st century, gets people where they need to go with the least impact possible, or we can build another seaport. The hybrid concept, as discussed, was sort of, it was the state moving away from a wide viaduct option to have less impact on the river. So that was good, and it was originally promising. But with this entirety of Soldiers Field Road and the river for up to a decade is unacceptable. Basically, we started out with a pig, as I showed earlier. We put a lot of lipstick on it. The hybrid was a way of putting even more lipstick on a pig, but it wound up still being a pig with lipstick on it. We need to talk about the demand. The turnpike was overbuilt for when it was built, and it probably overbuilt for current traffic. There's actually some good data coming up on this, and we should continue discussing it. The 3-lane sections, this is almost my personal opinion, having looked at these data recently, but this is where we are. The 3-lane sections west of Newton Corner actually carry as much traffic as the 4-lane section in Allston does. So should we double down in the 1950s where we want to put more cars, more pavement, and more pollution, or should we build a roadway which pushes, and should we build a roadway which pushes more cars through, which only then go into downtown Boston and Cambridge, which are also congested urban roadways? This chart here may be a little tough to show, but what it does show is you can see in sort of the green beige color, that's the number of cars coming through the toll gantries that they have up at peak hour. This is data, this is daily data, so this is an average weekday. So in the morning, there are about 5,000 cars going westbound, rather in the morning, there's 5,000 to 6,000 cars going eastbound. In the afternoon, there's only about 5,000 cars going westbound. If you look at the yellow and the purple, which are bus passengers and commuter rail passengers, there are actually as many people on transit in the morning and evening as there are in cars. But what I really want to show here is that if you look at the turnpike, at the different portions of the turnpike, there are really only 5,000 cars at any given time on it, at least on the westbound section. Whether it has 4 lanes, as it does in Allston, or whether it has 3 lanes, as it does all the way out to Framingham, where volumes begin to drop off. So when we see a lot of traffic on the roadway, it's not necessarily because there's not enough lanes, but because there are bottlenecks and because there is that demand and because we don't have good enough transit. Now, if we go and we build a wider highway, we will probably still have that traffic. But if we right-size the highway, if we size it for the amount of traffic that we currently have and say we are going to encourage us to have less traffic, then we can try to improve that. The other piece is that the commuter rail right now runs 4 trains per hour and it carries as many people as the turnpike does. The commuter rail, the way that we operate it, really can only run 4, maybe it could add a few trains per hour, but if we move to what we call a regional rail plan, and which I'll get to in a second, the commuter rail can carry probably twice or even 3 times as many people as it does today. And the 2 tracks of commuter rail could carry significantly more than the 8 lanes of highway. The other piece is the Kendall connection, which has become an important destination, and with the cancellation of the 1970s era Interbelt Highway, which would have put more bridges and more highway interchanges, so I'm glad we don't have that. It has grown because of transit access, not highway access. There's no highway to Kendall, but there's no good way to get there from the west. To get there from the west requires on transit going all the way into South Station, transferring onto the Red Line, going through downtown and winding up at Kendall Square. But it's only about a mile from where we are at West Station, where we're talking about here. So, and so most people drive, because not that the traffic is, well, assume when there's new traffic, not that the traffic is fun to drive in, but because there's no good alternative. So we can either build more pavement in Allston, and more pavement, more impermeable ground, more traffic, or we can build a good transit connection. The other thing, as I said before, we don't want to build a Seaport 2.0. So we don't want to build, MassDOT plans have improved somewhat. They're still car-centric. We need a cars-first approach means that we have roads that are hostile to pedestrians, and even if you have good transit, it's harder to get to. If you build it, they will come. So make sure you build transit and not as many roads as possible. These are some quick slides from Transit Matters about regional rail. This would be in the long run. You would have frequent service every 15 minutes on a line like the Worcester line, more frequently at rush hour. Electrification, high-level platforms, the trains would behave like a subway and would have the capacity of a subway. For the Worcester line, the Worcester line has shown that there's obviously interest. And so how we look to get there is adding frequency during mitigation and improving bottlenecks on the train line, which there are, but then really improving the train line so that more people can get there, improving. And that may even mean adding parking, adding feeder, adding bike and pedestrian access further west so that people don't have to drive. Pallavi showed these earlier. These are some of the waterways currently along that come into the river, and these are not really what we'd like to see. Some of these are more than a century old. There was a pretty high-thinking urban design team that looked at what you could imagine Salt Creek being if, and that's something called Salt Creek, which would allow it to be daylighted and provide some stormwater runoff, but in an urban environment. And so I wanted to look at where this all comes from. Where are we? So this is 1875. You can actually see this is something called Map Junction from actually the BPDA in Boston. It's if you were into old maps, it is amazing, mapjunction.com. This shows Salt Creek when it actually was flowing. So it was actually the Boston and Brookline border when Brookline, before Allston and Brighton were annexed and a sliver of land was taken by the city of Boston. And shows how the creek ran into the Charles River. 50 years later, it had been built over with a rail yard. So it actually shows up as a culvert on this map, and I put it in as a blue line, and that'll come up in a moment. And you can see Braves Field, the Boston Braves are still in town then. This is currently, where the rail yard is, and if we go to current, this is what we have today. So we have the highway, we have the railroad, and we have still Salt Creek there. What I want to talk about is how do we put river and people first? So how do we minimize the impact on the river, and how do we connect people to it? Then how do we build transit that must be resilient and scalable? How do we build transit that has the ability to move more people through on trains and buses than on cars, which really does not take a lot of room because transit is that much more efficient at moving people? And then assuming we still need the roads, which there probably will be some need for, how wide do they need to be? What configuration do they need to be? Instead of running a model and saying how much road do we need, run a model saying how little road can we get away with. The idea then is that can we save space along the river? So if we don't need all 8 highway lanes, we can actually save 11 to 12 feet per lane. That means 11 to 12 feet. They were not pushing elements into or in towards the river. And it might be possible to do that, but we really need to look at how that is. But this is going to be 10 years with 3 lanes of traffic on the turnpike. If we can get away with 10 years, maybe we can get away with that forever. And then reducing the impact of other limits. So the Grand Junction rail tracks at some point have to cross over the turnpike. If it's above grade, it requires an expensive high-impact viaduct. My original concept that got me involved with this about 6 years ago was a rail viaduct to pull out of the river. Well, we've moved to sort of the hybrid move from that towards a viaduct for Soldiers Field Road, which is a little less intrusive, but still quite a lot lot of concrete, a lot of construction issues. 2 fewer tracks is 30 to 32 feet of width. Combined with 2 fewer lanes, that would be 50 to 60 feet that we wouldn't be building into the river. And there's been some discussion recently that has never been talked about of whether that could be done actually in a tunnel where the Grand Junction would go under the turnpike and then under the river. This is something that's been discussed by some project areas. This white area would show the length of that tunnel, most of which would be either in the rail yard or in the project area to get to the Grand Junction to Cambridge. And would be built as part of the project. It would have to cross the river on a relatively short, there would be impact there, but that would be temporary impact and it wouldn't require probably going to the river. If you overlay on top of that, that would then allow, and these are the paths we'd really like to see in any iteration. These are the elements that we're looking at. So coming in from the east, you'd have Grand Junction Bridge and the path along the river, but also what we call an Aganis connector. So from Aganis Arena to the river, the Salt Creek the issue would be getting the rail over under Salt Creek. That continues to be. And then this is the People's Pike that would run west near West Station and then run out towards Allston. So that would allow people from Brookline to easily access the river, from Allston to access the river without crossing all the roadways, from the BU Bridge to access Cambridge without crossing the BU Bridge, and really improve the access along the river. So how do we get there? And I think we've talked about this as well, but we need to make sure that we prioritize people in the environment, ask the hard questions about really how much road capacity we need, make it clear that the Charles River and bicycling, walking, and pedestrian transit access, rather, is as important or more important than maximizing highway throughput. And what we really have done for the last several years is we've started with the highway and then fit the community and around it. And I think we need to start with the community and then fit the highway and around it.
So with that, let's open it up to the Q&A, and we've gotten some via email that I'll start with because otherwise I'm going to forget. John from Newton. Shouldn't MBTA and MassDOT assign a manager to coordinate the Allston Interchange project with air right development projects along the Pike, South Station, Pike 495 Interchange project, Green Line Transformation project, and the Riverside Station? This would include coordination for temporary and permanent commuter parking, alternate buses and bus storage, train storage, etc. All these projects overlap. The big dig managers, including MBTA and MassDOT, took this very seriously, and the cost-loaded scheduling logistics effort were well worth it, saved millions.
It sounds like a question for me.
Yes, I think so.
I think save millions in the big dig is, I guess, something where saving millions is that's a great point that I was trying to make and maybe didn't get across. That really just needs to be seen as a regional project, as the Charles River really extends back along this corridor with some bends as well. But yeah, we have 495 coming down the pike, so to speak. We have the air rights development. We have many years where we're going to have these impacts. And how do we, a lot of it's going to be mitigation. How do we really entice people onto, off of the roadway during and potentially even after construction? One thing that at least we're not talking about, which we see in some other cities, is adding capacity. So we're reworking how some of the ramps go. We're not adding capacity. But even still, I think that's a good idea that has not been talked about at MassDOT. They have a pretty siloed view. And that is, but on the other hand, we've had a lot of work with the legislatures. So every time there's been a comment period, we've had a letter signed by all of the legislators from basically Allston west to Worcester. And I think the last one had 45 signatories on it, which is more than 20% of the legislators in the State House. And the reason that we've sort of seen a bit of what I call a divide and conquer strategy from the state at times, which has been to try to say, these people want good transit, these people want good pedestrian access, these people want the river to be improved. Can we play them against each other? And one of the things is that while we do all have our own goals, I think we've done a good job of working together. And they've also tried to say we play off the people in Allston who want less impact on the neighborhood from people who in Newton and further west who want a good commute, and said, well, you can't have a train that stops and Boston at Boston Landing or some such, or West Station. So I think we've done a good job on the community side of working against that tide, but it really is a legislative issue to get MassDOT to look at all of those. So that's a great question. I don't really have an answer for you, but talk to your legislator and tell them you want better coordination.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get to some of the other questions. So Amelia, I think you already answered this in your presentation. Don't we need more trains and rail yards, not less? Why on earth would we cede this space for a highway? Not very forward thinking.
That's a great question. So the space is sort of preceded to being a highway when the state sold it to Harvard 15 years ago. It's sort of bad and good. If they hadn't sold it to Harvard, they would probably sort of do whatever they wanted, but because they have to build in the Harvard bought it from them for a lot of money, they have to build that in. As far as the rail facilities go, yes, we do need more trains. And what we want to have here is 4 tracks at West Station, which would allow trains to pass through without conflict. The state wanted 3. They were modeling 1 train per hour stopping here at rush hour, which means that most people would drive, which means more cars on the turnpike, which means more cars in this area, more parking. This area, the state wants to use this as what they call midday layover yards. A midday layover yard means the train comes into South Station, and then there's a train every 20 minutes or half hour or 40 minutes, depending on the line, at rush hour, and then a train every 2 to 3 hours during the midday. And then when you're only running a quarter as much service during the midday, you need somewhere to put the trains. And MassDOT's solution is to build rail yards. What I've been saying and trying to say, and what sort of the regional rail says for everyone, is we don't really do that with the Red Line. The Red Line doesn't run every 5 minutes of rush hour and every half hour during the middle of the day. So instead of building rail yards to have trains sit in them, we could run more service to provide more service to people, so that that person who needs to leave Worcester needs to be in Boston at 11:30, but there's no train that gets there between 9:30 and noon, can get there, and then they are another car that's not on the highway, and they might be coming back at rush hour with those trains. So it's sort of a trade-off. There is probably need for more rail facilities, but we really shouldn't be doubling down on the past, which is, we really are as an 1800s model of how trains are run with commuter rail, and we really should be looking at least the 20th century model.
Thank you, and I appreciate what you said about so many stakeholders and working together, and we've been excited to be working with you as well as the folks from Walk Boston and other groups that have, everyone's got their own sort of passion. But in this case, it's very easy to be working together because we also want to see more parks, and it's actually better for the river to have more people taking the train, not only because then there would be less of at least an excuse for putting a road in the river, but also because phosphorus from gasoline dripping onto the roads and then ending up in the Charles River causes cyanobacteria and invasive growth. So there really is, it's all connected. Adding another question here. Looks like a comment from Lynn. We would like to add river users to your lists and perspectives: rowers, kayakers, powerboat users, canoers. Pallavi, have you heard from those groups? Have they been involved in the task force and other meetings?
Absolutely. So ever since the temporary relocation of Soldiers Field Road has been put out by DOT, we have actively brought a lot of the river users and organizations like the CRI, CRAB, etc. to the table. Mass DOT went in and made a presentation to the river users, but since that time they've been very active in the project, and a lot of the impacts to the watershed have been fully contested by these users. So yes, I would say at this point the river users are very actively looking at this project and making their voices heard. So was not the case before the road ended up in the river, but now we have
now we have their attention.
That we totally have their attention. And they've been great about putting in their comment letters and showing up to the task force meetings.
Okay, great. Here's a question. How much tunnel can we do? We put the pike into a tunnel.
Yeah, I saw this in the chat. I started chuckling. We could do anything. We built a big dig, right? So we built a highway under a highway through a city, and weaved it over a number of different rail lines downtown. But that would take this from $1 billion project to a $10 billion project. And there are some limits to sort of what we can do. The issue with putting something like the turnpike in a tunnel is that you have all sorts of ventilation and egress issues. You would have to figure out how to do quite a bit of grade work. And if the turnpike was in a tunnel, then the rail line would be at grade, so you wouldn't put the rail line underneath the turnpike. So you would save some room, but not as much. You know, if you think about coming from the west, the turnpike would have to come through Allston, somehow descend into a tunnel with Allston ramps, which wouldn't be easy. Then we'd have to come back to grade to go over the Muddy River. There's also the Green Line, the Riverside Line, the C Line, and D Line, which go under the tunnel. So actually by Beacon Street, it would have to be back to grade. So you wind up either building no tunnel or a several miles long tunnel, which would be very complicated to do. So the answer is probably not. You know, if we're going to build some amount of tunnel, we sort of have to build the least amount. We do need the reason that tunnel is sort of proposed is there needs to be one grade separation between the rail and the road. And in this, what we have right now is the roadway going over the railroad, which means that we have a half-mile long viaduct. The idea would be, can we move everything down or have sort of a smaller grade separation? But yeah, it is sort of a question of how much can we build, and I think the answer is that putting the highway in a tunnel would be pretty much infeasible.
Okay, thank you. Another question, does the pandemic change any of your thinking?
Well, I'll let Pallavi start. I think it's mostly for me, but I don't know if it changes yours as well.
I wouldn't say it changes our advocacy or any of our priorities. It does definitely make the process probably a lot longer than any of us would like to see, but from where we're sitting, we are definitely expecting this project to sort of go through the review timeline that's been proposed and possibly take way longer than what's projected right now.
Yeah, I might add that I'm hoping that this will sort of increase the general concern for the environment and willingness of the public to spend more and focus on environmental considerations that we would like to see related to this project. This is sort of obviously a very difficult time, and we all hope to get through it with as little loss of life and suffering as possible. But it would be great if, in the end, it does make us think, wow, you know, a lot more people can work from home than probably realize. We really probably don't need as much road capacity as we've had, and you know, there are more things that we could be doing to protect our environment that maybe we didn't think there would be a general willingness to do. And so it is my hope that that is one of the you know, some of the fallout from what we're all going through. Ari?
Yeah, I'd add to that you know, obviously this has upended pretty much everything in society, and that sort of includes the transportation sector. You know, we don't know really what transit's going to look like. We don't know what driving. If everyone who takes a train decides to drive and everyone goes back to work one day, we'll have twice as many people trying to drive on the turnpike. Well, the turnpike is at 100% capacity, so that we can't have that. So what is the calculus going to be? Will we have something that makes people comfortable taking transit? Will we not? Right now, you can't run on the path along the river without, if you pass someone, you're within 6 feet of them because the path's only about 7 feet or 8 feet wide, and actually is narrower as you go towards River Street, where it's about 4 feet wide. And I think the other piece, one thing is that we've seen that people are more affected when there is when they live close to pollution. So really, we need to talk about having less pollution. I think the other piece is that I had something profound I was going to say, and now it's beginning to slip my mind.
You're too young for that.
I know. No, the other piece is I was going to say is that when we talk about sort of the width of the roadway, and I know there's a question about Star Oak Drive, which I'll sort of fold into this, but we talk about the width of the roadway, that the roadway right now, the fourth lane is only needed by about, I guess you're supposed to use the Q&A, but I'm watching in chat. Anyway, that fourth lane is only really used by peak traffic in one direction for about an hour and a half of the day. And so if we can make changes to transit, work from home, and other things like that to sort of flatten off that peak, if we can price it dynamically, if we can do something, that could save us literally hundreds of millions of dollars in construction costs and obviously, immeasurable environmental benefits. And so we sort of need to look at the return of investment for various elements on this project. And are we spending an extra $200 million to move a few hundred extra people in traffic at rush hour, which doesn't really do much for anyone? So I think we sort of have to have long-term discussions about that.
Okay, well, speaking of long-term discussions, I'm going to read a question from one of our CRWA board members. Sarah's question: given the current flooding along Storrow Drive and the MassDOT projections of climate change impacts with massive inundation in that area, are there discussions and considerations of a completely different alignment for I-90 away from the flood zone?
Thanks, Sarah, for bringing that up. As you probably know, we've been pushing DOT to consider climate change right from the inception early on this project, and there's been total reluctance on their part to go that route. There's obviously been always an acknowledgement that that will be something that will be studied in terms of impacts, but for one reason or the other, climate change adaptation has not been the driver on the engineering on this project, and that's, in my view, a huge lost opportunity. So the kinds of options that you're suggesting have not been considered by DOT at all.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we got a lot of comments here. Let's see. Oh, I'm supposed to be looking at the Q&A. See, I'm learning how we go here. So this is is from anonymous attendee. From many similar issues here with Suffolk Downs and East Boston. Suffolk Downs is being essentially decided by Mayor Walsh and the city's planning authority with a role of MBTA and MassDOT. Who is the decider here, and to what concerns and groups are they most responsive? Sort of a process question.
So as Ari mentioned and I alluded to, the task force, which has been the review body on this, consists of numerous stakeholder agencies, from advocacy organization to the BPDA. So the city has had some issues that they brought up, but it's definitely DOT that's driving this project and the process. So I would say, the advocacy agencies have been pretty effective, but it's not like the city of Boston has been involved any more than the rest of the advocacy groups. So DOT has definitely driven this process, and now with the NEPA review, there's been some involvement from Federal Highway, which has been great.
Next to Glenn, Pallavi and Ari, great presentations. Great comment, Glenn, thank you. Question, just talking about the throat, I worry that all the recent criticisms of the hybrid might lead MassDOT to revive its old highway viaduct concept, because that's the only option to avoid any even temporary impact on the river. I'd like to hear each of you try and help explain why we shouldn't be worried that the highway viaduct model is going to rear its ugly head again. With this pandemic, I have more than enough worries already on my plate.
I think I know which Glenn this is, Glenn. I mean, it's a reasonable question. The highway viaduct, since we've sort of moved away from it and probably people don't know, is basically taking the current viaduct and building it actually about 20 feet wider towards the river, keeping the railroad under it, keeping sort of a narrow riverfront path next to Soldiers Field Road. It might actually increase some parkland, but a lot of that wouldn't see sun for about 4 months of the year and really is not preferable, and also really doesn't provide any connections between the river and the neighborhood. So we'd still have a mile of riverfront sort of cut off from the area. So obviously this is not something we are, I think any of us want. I think the idea is that if the state just comes back with that, or with the, oh, let's just patch up the highway for a few years and hope it doesn't fall down, we need to really tell them to put on their thinking caps. I don't know if I have a better answer for it than that.
I will actually jump into this one. Wait, Pallavi. So one of the most powerful testimonials that I heard at the last MassDOT board meeting where we testified was from Tom Powers, who is involved with CRWA, and his wife is on our board, but he was with DEP during the building of the Big Dig. And he said, so I was on your side of the table with people commenting to us, and this was the time before the Zachem Bridge was built, and folks were trying to figure out how that project was going to cross the Charles River over there, and then they got as far as Scheme Z because there were 26 plans, and that were terrible. And it was only after that, with so much pushback from the community, that we ended up with the architect who came forward and designed the Zachem Bridge, which is now this iconic entrance and exit from Boston that we are all so proud of. So I take from that great heart that we are incredibly, especially this community, Massachusetts, the Boston community, very creative, very educated, and that we can do better than what we have now. And I don't think that anyone wins if we end up with a project that is just rebuilding the viaduct and replicating the problems that we have now. So I do feel pretty strongly that the advocacy that we're doing, and that all of you who are here watching will do, will end up with a better product and project. So I don't know if Pallavi, you have more to add.
I just was going to say, early on when the three alternatives were put on table, I think we made it pretty clear as a task force that the highway viaduct was not by any means something we'd like to see continue. So I would hope that would still resound if that option ever came back.
Yes, okay. So this is similar. Your approach, this is Merrill Kessler. Your approach is so common sense. Does MassDOT get it, or are they such narrow highway engineers intent on building highways that it falls on deaf ears? How do we convince them? I think that's sort of related what I was trying to get to. I think with pushing back on things we don't like and encouraging the things we do like, I think that we can get there. I don't know if either of you have more to add than that.
Continue advocacy, show up to meetings, and make your voice heard.
So I know this person, Audrey, are people thinking about the impact of increased working capacity on future traffic volumes? An increase in working capacity.
If by that you mean that they're if let's say a pre-COVID, post-COVID, right, that we have continued job growth in the region on traffic capacity. I think no one has said here that we should be building. Luckily, we are. I think to almost answer the last question, we are at least past a place in Massachusetts where we are building more capacity. There's just a story out of Portland, Oregon, where they have a highway actually sort of similar to this highway that is near a river, and they're adding lanes to it to solve a bottleneck. We are past adding lanes to solve bottlenecks, at least. At least that's what we say. I think the answer from the transit matter side, and really I think from everyone, is that if there are increased jobs in this region, if the economy does come back in the next few years and it continues to increase, we need to get people to those jobs without more cars. And the idea here would be to have some combination of 10 to 20,000 residents and jobs on the Allston site. And we need to look at getting the vast majority of those people back and forth on bicycles, by walking, on buses, and on trains, and not in cars. Because if it's all in cars, we don't have room on the turnpike for that, and we're not building anymore. And then if you were to build more capacity here, you would have to build more capacity to the west, out to Newton Corner, out to 128. You'd have to build more capacity east towards towards the Southeast Expressway, and there's nowhere to do that, no room for that. So, building capacity here won't actually make any more capacity and won't allow any more cars.
Thank you. I see Representative Kay Khan, my own representative in Newton. She writes, the idea of more frequent service will become more important because under the situation we are in now with COVID-19, the thought of crowding on trains may turn people away and into their cars. And I think Ari spoke to that. So anonymous person, Harvard owns all of the land in Allston that abuts Soldiers Field Road, which they plan to develop in what looks like another seaport district. They must understand that with climate change occurring, that area is going to flood even more. As a stakeholder in all of this, do you know where they stand on that issue? And I will let, Pallavi has something to say about that. She's been talking to them for 10 years or so.
Sure. Yes, they are very well aware of the issues with climate change and their entire section of what they're calling as the Enterprise Research Campus being inundated with floodwaters, and their response so far has been to kind of elevate that entire section of land to get it out of the floodplain levels. But the consequence of that is everything upstream of that then faces the repercussions. So we've been trying to get them to incorporate a lot of what I talked about in this presentation to the green infrastructure strategies that would not only help with water quality improvement, but also provide some flood storage. And they've been open to those ideas, but Harvard hasn't engaged back with the public for over a year now in terms of their plans for the Enterprise Research Campus. So the hope is that they are going to be putting in some of these strategies and coming back to showcase what they are proposing, since they have a developer now on board. But it's been an ongoing, I guess, conversation with them, and they have been not that forthcoming at least in the past 6 months on what the plans are. But our hope is that that's going to change come summer.
Yeah, and we did have a meeting somewhat recently with Tom Glynn, who Harvard hired from Mass Port to run this whole development project, and they were very interested in what we had to say, and it just seemed like they're not, that the planning isn't very far along yet, but they know what we want to see, and they know that we're going to stay in touch with them about that, and there will be a public process that we will be letting people know about, as hopefully they will as well. All right, anonymous, goal. Keep the road out of the river and shorten the construction period. The throat area is an unimportant 1/4 mile next to 10 lanes of traffic and facing the rear end of BU. It will never be a nice quote unquote park. All bike paths have stretches that are not parks but are through segments. Let this area be a through segment. Widen the path by 8 feet or so and keep the design simple. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I'll give a response to that. If you have a way to do that, have at it. We'd love to hear it. If there's a simple way to do this, let us know.
Right. From Molly, to encourage more transit from the west versus car, there's a desperate need for parking. Can you please add this to your plans?
Yeah, we haven't talked about that, but that it is it is true that there are basically parking lots, which again, this is pre-COVID numbers, would fill up at 7 or 7:30 in the morning. There is a need for more parking there's really the need for two things. There's a need for more parking or for more places where people can safely and easily get to a train station without cars. And I think there are a lot of ways to address this. And this really should be mitigation for this project for 495, as someone else asked earlier, where there would be additional parking at some of the park and ride stations, perhaps additional parking on the the Needham line and the Fitchburg line. Fitchburg line at 128 doesn't have a station, and that could siphon demand off there. Perhaps bus shuttle connections that would allow people to get to the train without driving, and then bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and perhaps even some new stations to better access. So right now, if you look at Westboro, the town of Westboro doesn't have a station in the town. It was built as a parking lot, but there's actually a big parking lot downtown on the site of an old factory where you could have some amount of parking. That has to be part of this process. We've discussed that. We don't want to. It's not really something front and center right now. But yes, if we can, put 1,000 cars that each drive 2 miles to get on a train, it's better than having them drive through this traffic. So it's fair point.
Yeah, but it does get to the point raised earlier about really this isn't just about the throat area. This is about a whole vision for transportation for the area and how we can give people more mobility options that are cleaner, better for the environment, and better for the river. So Greg from Newton, Greg, why not argue for less Storrow Drive? 2 lanes or 3 with a swing lane, or remove it entirely?
That's also a good question, and the answer is I think it would be a hard discussion to have just from the amount of throughput that we have. But a 2-lane Storrow Drive might be feasible with a 4-lane turnpike. If the turnpike, right now, a lot of what Storrow does is act as a distributor. So cars will come in on the turnpike or come in from the north and then use Storrow Drive to get to BU Bridge to get to the Longwood Medical area. If you could use the turnpike from that, if there were ramps to Beacon Street that would allow cars or perhaps cars and buses to make that, then maybe Storrow Drive could be rebuilt as something more like Nahanton Road in Newton, where it was a narrower roadway with less impact. The interesting now, Nahanton Road has a lot less traffic throughput than Storrow Drive, but it was narrowed from 4 lanes to 2 without any decrease in throughput and without any increase in congestion. So
now my mother, if she were watching, would push back on that. She claims it's much worse at rush hour, but I think it's fine. But just so you know, there's a little.
Well, I mean, we can talk about anecdotal congestion, but
she's watching, not losing her mind.
Yes, the data I've seen is that's not the case, but we can talk about that. The other piece is that we really do need to have that discussion about all the different ways through that. But that would be one of them. I think you would need to pair it with some other interventions. So looking at the amount of traffic on Storrow Drive and where that traffic is going and what other routes it could use, what other modes it could use as well.
Another point I'll make is that we've been speaking as well with Doug Foy and Robin Chase, who've written a couple op-eds in the Globe recently about why not take this opportunity to return Storrow Drive to more of a parkway, more like Com Ave with traffic lights, so that it's really something that pedestrians could easily cross, but that the cars would go much slower, and it really would be much more of providing access to the park rather than a mini highway, which is really how it's used now. So that's sort of part of this. We didn't really have time to incorporate in this evening, but just wanted to raise that with folks, that's a conversation that's happening as well. Carl writes, the existing plan was a compromise reached after years of meetings. Then the state needed to figure out how to build it. That's how we got to the temporary bridge in the river. I don't see how anything that you're discussing changes that. If we are going to keep the roadways nominally open, there still needs to be a staging area somewhere for the construction.
That's a fair point. I would push back on the plans being a compromise. It was the current plan is sort of a constructed compromise, which started from the state saying having a lot of conditions on the project, and really what we were able to do is sort of start with what the state started with and push back. Staging for this project will be quite complex no matter what is decided. The roadway there's all sorts of different elements, whether the Grand Junction track remains open to allow equipment moves to the commuter rail between the north and south sides, whether the turnpike is temporarily put at grade, how much needs to be put in the river, if any, and various other things. But I do not think we have had a full good faith discussion about that. And I think that's really what people are interested in.
Okay, thank you. That's fair. Anonymous. Also, this will have a big effect on Boston University as well. Any comments from those stakeholders?
Boston University is in an odd place on this because while they do abut the project, they don't own the land. And I would say, and Pallavi, you might be able to chime in on this as well, that the landowner, being mostly Harvard, has sort of kept their cards close to their chest. I think there's sort of like a game of chicken with the state of they want to get this built, but they don't want to pay for the state's highway, which is, I think, fair, although it will be paid for with tolls to some degree and perhaps federal funding as well. So that's a whole different topic that we could have another really dry, boring chat about. Boston University has committed to allowing, I think, 7.5 feet of their property to be taken by the state in a friendly taking to move things away from the river, which is really the maximum that can be. They have some large buildings that have access and egress there, so they have been reasonably helpful with this. But because they don't actually own any of the land, they are in a place where they can only provide so much. I don't know, Pallavi, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say they are part of the I-90 task force, so they have a seat at the table. And as I already mentioned, in terms of their contribution to this project, they have allowed for that easement to bring things closer and more distance from the river, and also offered the contribution to the West Station construction. But beyond that, I don't believe they've been very I guess, involved in the project planning. But they definitely have a seat at the table.
Another question. As a frequent river user, I would like to maintain the existing river width. However, I would prefer modest river filling to a temporary or permanent bridge built on piles in the river. Modest fill would result in an esplanade-like appearance, whereas a bridge would tend to shade the river vegetation and capture trash. How is this decision being made? I don't know if they were here for the beginning of your presentation, Pallavi, but maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. So the temporary structure was definitely only has been posed as a construction duration intervention, and also we didn't talk too much about this, but from the Department of Environmental Protection side, they are not in favor of permanent fill in the river. And so even for the temporary intervention, DOT would have to get pretty sophisticated plans in place for mitigation and making sure that the temporary structure does not impact the ecosystem and the sediments on the bottom of the river. But from DEP's standpoint, they are not willing to have a situation where there's permanent fill being proposed by DOT.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to skip that one because we answered it. Why not alewife style parking at West Station?
Well, I guess there's two reasons. One is the turnpike is at capacity all the way out to 128, so we'd like to get people out of their cars earlier. The second one is that I don't think Harvard, who owns that land, is interested in a big parking garage. Parking garages are quite expensive to build, and they don't really add to the urban realm. So if we're going to have people parking parking their cars to get on transit, we want to get them onto transit further from downtown.
Okay, here's another, I think, Ari question. Could we allow bikes on the T, designate the last car for bikes during rush hour so that we could ride to the T, take the T, then ride to our offices? This works in England, last car on the train reserved for bicycles.
It's a great question. We need more cars for that. It works in San Francisco as well. They have cars as well. I think the climate here is not as conducive to bicycling, and we also have the ability to use bike share downtown, or even leave a bike at a station downtown and not bring it on the train. But or folding bikes as well. Folding bikes are allowed in the T at all times. So maybe in the long run, maybe that could be some mitigation, but we require purchasing new additional cars because at rush hour, at least in pre-COVID times, the commuter rail rush hour is quite near capacity.
Here's another one. How did MassDOT decide that the hybrid approach was the consensus option? In the scoping report, they made it seem like the Charles River impacts of the all-at-grade option were deal breakers, but listening to the presenters tonight, it seems like at grade is ultimately best for the river. If they're not answering to CRWA for environmental concerns, to whom are they answering?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm not sure why the viewer thinks that grade is the best option, because even when that was a viable option, there was definitely a lot more intervention into the river. So the hybrid option was the only one that actually kept all the modes operational within the right-of-way that was available, and that was why it was the preferred option.
Okay, thank you. I think this might be the last one. Also, how will car sharing and self-driving technologies affect future commuting?
Your guess is as good as mine. We really don't know. I mean, we can come up with any number of scenarios, but basically self-driving car is still a car, and we would have to figure out where to put it on the road. We might actually have more cars because self-driving cars would be cheaper, might draw people out of transit, but there's only so much road space, and roads are actually at basically full capacity. And there's a lot of people will say, oh, but can't you platoon cars together and such? No one's really shown that technology to work, and I think it would be very difficult to. Self-driving cars have been 5 years away for the last 10 years. I don't see that changing anytime in the next decade or 10. So we'll see.
Actually, one more comment. There's an example of this kind of ramp over the river at the end of Memorial Drive and the Salt and Pepper Bridge. This seems to be an example of how I think they meant to say not to solve a transportation problem. It is dangerous to river users, sailors, rowers, kayakers, and even powerboats. I can see this as a total nightmare if it is done on the large bend in the river at the throat. Maybe you can point this out to the powers that be.
Will do.
That's a great point, and that bridge was built in 1957, so I think that's more of the let's not go back to the 1950s, so agreed.
In so many ways. Okay, well, it is 8:23. I love to end a presentation on time, so we'll call it a night with that. Thank you both so much for these terrific presentations, and we are going to have a recording at the CRWA website. I don't know when, but soon. And look forward to folks participating again. Thank you all so much, and have a great night.
All right. Thanks for all the questions, everyone.
Yes, and thank you for spending the evening with us. This was really an interesting discussion. Thank you all.
All right, great. Thanks.